And with that, I would like to welcome our guest, Ty. Ty's first book, Where You'll Find Me, Risk Decisions and the Last Climb of Kate Matrasova, is the story of an experienced mountaineer who set off for a presidential traverse in winter, I think in February, if I remember, and never returned, which I think is not a spoiler given the title of the book. Ty works in risk management and is also a member of the board of directors of the Mount Washington Observatory, I think just since last month. I'm right about that. I read The Last Traverse when it first came out because I've been doing a lot of winter hiking myself this year. And I have to say, it's one of the most gripping as well as harrowing books I've ever read. It's a fantastic read and I couldn't put it down. I recommend it to everyone, not only because it's a great read, but for anyone who does anything outdoors. It's a really interesting analysis of the kinds of things that induce us to bad decisions. And things can always go south outdoors. And it's not a bad kind of set of considerations to be familiar with. Ty, welcome, and thanks so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Jared, for that nice introduction. You can keep going if you'd like. I mean, you have a good grasp of the book, and I very much appreciate what you said. And I'd also like to thank Megan for getting in touch with me and for giving me the opportunity to talk tonight. So I'm just going to share my screen here. But as I get this ready to go, I just want to tell you how much I appreciate the opportunity to be in Hanover, even though virtually, because Dartmouth Hitchcock played such a significant role in this story. And Jed Williamson, a Hanover resident, is somebody that I have a lot of admiration for and just really appreciate the work that he has done, really decades of work on accident analysis in alpine environments. And so just to be here is just, it's special. And I again, Megan, thanks so much for the invitation. So I just wanted to start with a quote by Saul Bellow, another author. A writer is a reader moved to emulation. And that certainly is the case for me in regard to, all that I've written about with stories out of the White Mountains. And going back, I've climbed and hiked for most of my life. I was introduced to rock climbing in between my 5th and 6th grade year by my industrial arts teacher in elementary school, and who I consider to be my climbing partner and mentor still today. So I had that passion for the sport, but there's one piece of work in particular that's very much resonated with me and has been a source of inspiration, much like Jed Williamson's work. And I can remember coming home one day, and in my mom's kitchen was this Yankee magazine. She was a loyal reader of Yankee magazine. This was February 1995. And I was immediately drawn to the cover of this, that bold type, Killer Mountain, the deadly lure of New Hampshire's Mount Washington. And as I was reading through the work, it was just a series of stories about accidents that had taken place in the presidential range of New Hampshire, really over time, drawing way back to even the first accident that was recorded there. And I was very drawn into this. And not long after that, Nick Howe, who had written the piece for Yankee magazine, released his book, Not Without Peril. And for me, this book is the standard for White Mountain writing, particularly regarding accidents in the White Mountains, that there is. And I always go back to this. I draw great inspiration from it, and just am grateful for the tremendous amount of research and writing that Mr. Howe did to get this work out there. There's another source of influence for me, which came from a really personal experience that I had, which I shared in the prologue of the first book, Where You'll Find Me. This is a photograph I took on Franconia Ridge in February of 2008, as I was doing a winter traverse of the ridge with the two that are in this image here. I was invited to go with them. I had never met them, let alone hiked with them before, but had always wanted to do the Franconia Ridge in the wintertime, and was just given the opportunity to go. My hiking partner and mentor wasn't there that day. I suspect things may have gone differently for me had they been, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about those kinds of interpersonal dynamics a little bit later on in the presentation. But frankly, this is the most trouble I've ever been in the mountains. I did not have the level of physical fitness that I needed for this particular objective that we had set out for ourselves on that day. The winds were very strong out of the west, which can be very taxing as you're constantly trying to just reorient yourself on the trail. So, I'm tired. The wind is doing its number. The visibility is very, very low. And I'm not focusing on self-care. I'm not hydrating. I'm not eating. And I got exhausted. And to back up a little bit more, from the moment I woke up that morning to get ready, I didn't want to go, but I couldn't bring myself to pick up the phone to call to back out of this commitment. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about why that happens too later on in the session. But I got through this after just a lot of suffering. I kind of hit the wall. For those of you that have done or familiar with endurance sports, I'd completely run out of fuel, run out of energy. And I took so much away from this experience. I don't regret the experience at all, because the lessons I've learned were so important to me, not only in the mountains, but out of the mountains, in how I conduct myself and how I look at things. And it wasn't long after this, 8 days after this experience that I had, Fred Fredrickson, pictured here in the light blue shirt, sitting next to James Osborne. Both of them attempted to do the same loop I did, but in the opposite direction, 8 days after me. And they were overtaken by a storm. And tragically, Fred did not survive the accident, and James was critically injured. And I was still in the midst of a lot of self-reflection and self-criticism when this happened, and it really hit home for me. And this story has stayed with me since February of 2008 when it happened, and has also been a source of fuel for me in terms of what I write about and why I choose to write about these stories in general. So this will just give you a look at the ridge. And one of the things I did want to mention as I talk about James and Fred, I share my own experience because I think it's really important to be transparent about that if I'm going to be talking about other people's trouble and the decisions that led to that trouble in the mountains, I'm going to just be very open about my own. And just to give you some context, James and Fred had experience. Fred had a lot more experience than James did. He had been climbing for much of his life. He was very accustomed to going out hiking in all 4 seasons, did a lot of winter hiking, a lot of winter camping, had summited the 48 4,000 footers in New Hampshire, had summited the highest 100 summits in the Northeast, also referred to as the 100 highest, had spent time at Baxter State Park on Katahdin, and was just, this is what he did. He also had a very, very high level of physical fitness. He often exercised, worked out twice a day. And when he wasn't working, you could find Fred in the mountains. James, on the other hand, had been hiking for about a year and a half before the accident, and had done 37 of the 48 4,000 footers. So ticked off quite a few of them in a pretty short period of time, but had yet to go out in the winter, had yet to go above tree line in the wintertime, hadn't done a winter hike yet, but very much wanted to do it because he saw the way that Fred reacted oftentimes when he got back and was talking about his outings in the wintertime. And so actually the plan for Fred and James to do this traverse, and we'll follow the route, really was born the day after I did the traverse from this direction. And they saw each other at a small social event. You can see Cannon Cliff and Franconia Notch there to the left. And that's where this idea was born, and it evolved over the course of the week and would culminate with them hiking the following Sunday, a week from that initial meeting, on Sunday, February 10th, 2008. So this just gives you a look at the ridgeline from the direction that they were going to be heading in. Again, summiting Little Haystack on the southern side and traversing to the north. And I'll break this itinerary down a little bit more. The other point I want to make is that not only were James and Fred co-workers, they worked for Concord Coach, a really well-known and respected bus line that operates out of New Hampshire and throughout New England. Not only were they co-workers who were part of a small group of co-workers there at the bus line that went out hiking together or in combinations of, whoever was on a particular day off, they were also very, very close friends. And I'm going to talk about the impact our relationships can have on our decision-making in general, but I think it's very important for you to know that as we move further on into the story. One of the reasons I wanted to tell the story, among many, is that out here at the near the top right of this picture, you can see Mount Washington and the surrounding presidential range, which was the focus of the book, Not Without Peril. However, about just a little over 20 miles here to the west lies Franconia Ridge and Franconia Notch. And one of the reasons I wanted to tell the story is because the weather in Franconia Notch can often be as extreme, sometimes more extreme, as unpredictable and as unforgiving as what you're going to find here in the home of the world's worst weather. We all know that Mount Washington and the surrounding peaks have the reputation of having the home of the world's worst weather because it has the highest recorded wind speed on the planet at an occupied weather station, and that record at an occupied weather station still stands today. When weather approaches directly from the west, it arrives at Franconia Ridge before it reaches the presidentials. When it's coming from the northwest, it will often arrive here at the same time. Again, as I mentioned before, sometimes the weather is worse here before it gets really bad here. And so I wanted to raise awareness, particularly with the outdoor community, about the challenges associated not only with the weather, but the terrain, because this is really steep, challenging terrain. And it is a huge draw for people, whether they're seasoned hikers or not, because as we know, the interstate runs right through Franconia Notch, and it's very, very accessible to people. And it can often give this false sense of security, particularly when you can see the summits on a clear day, that it just looks so close and so attainable, where it does take a little bit more effort to get over to the presidentials. And those peaks are also, 5,000 feet plus, up just over 6,000 feet as Mount Washington is. As I'm sure people on the program tonight can recall, you probably remember driving south or north of Franconia Notch and it's clear blue sky out, and you drive into Franconia Notch and suddenly visibility is very poor. There might be blowing snow or sleet or heavy rain and heavy winds. You emerge on the other side of Franconia Notch on 93 and it's clear blue sky again. This terrain can generate some very complex weather. We'll talk about that again as we go. So let's look at the weather forecast for the Sunday of James and Fred's hike. And you'll note that a powerful low pressure system was going to be moving from west to east, and it was going to bring with it very cold temperatures, really dangerous wind chills, and high winds. And this was a well-known and well-publicized weather forecast that was known by many in the state just through the research that I had done. In terms of whether James and Fred checked the forecast, what I can tell you in my conversations with James is that he checked weather.com and AccuWeather.com sometime the week leading up to the hike, noted that there was going to be a weather event, but talked to Fred about this and said, hey, it looks like we might have some weather coming in Sunday. And Fred told him that they would be fine. And James was comfortable with that. In terms of whether Fred knew, based on the conversations I've had with people who knew him and people who were very close to him, Fred was aware that there was some weather coming in, but I can't tell you what weather outlet he checked. Normally what we would really encourage people to do is check the Mount Washington Observatory higher summits forecast, because that gives you a much more detailed forecast that's particular to the higher summits of the White Mountains than a more general weather outlet like weather.com or AccuWeather.com. One of the people closest to Fred mentioned the weather that was coming in to him and whether he was concerned about it. And he told this person that he believed that he and James would be down off the mountain in about 4 to 5 hours. and would essentially beat the weather forecast. The other thing I just wanted to mention as well is that Saturday night into Sunday morning before their hike, another low pressure system moved through the region and dropped a layer of snow throughout New Hampshire, heavier amounts of snow in the higher elevations, and that low pressure system would move out into the Gulf of Maine and stall there. And that's going to create some additional complexity to this weather event with that low pressure system out there. And I'll talk more about that later. One of the reasons I wanted to mention it now is the freshly fallen snow that's on the ground that has yet to freeze is going to become a big factor for Fred and James to contend with a little bit later on in the day. So this just gives you a little bit better sense of their itinerary from a map view. Franconia Notch, their plan was to park at the Lafayette Place parking lot at 8:30 that Sunday morning, which they did. They arrived on time. And again, their plan was to ascend Falling Waters, summit Little Haystack, traverse north over Lincoln, summit Mount Lafayette, descend the Greenleaf Trail, and then Old Bridle Path and finish where they actually started that morning. As they pulled into the parking lot, which again was unplowed because the crews hadn't got to it yet, James recalls seeing a few hikers that were equipped and heading out before he and Fred. James and Fred got ready. They then started to walk across the parking lot themselves, and another car pulled in with a solo hiker in it who is going to leave after them. So that just gives you a sense. There were some people out in front, and then it was James and Fred, and then this lone hiker. James and Fred got going. They were moving. The adrenaline's pumping for James. He's out on his first winter hike. Fred's in front of him in snowshoes. James is wearing crampons that he acquired on Friday before the Sunday hike. And they find pretty quickly that they are overheating. What we like to do generally when we're out hiking in the cold is we want to start out a little bit on the colder side because we know through exertion, we're going to start to perspire. And the last thing we want, particularly in the wintertime, when there's the potential for winds and exposure above tree line, is we don't want damp clothing. We can get hypothermic and pretty cold rather quickly. So they started to overheat. They stopped. They pulled off beside the trail. They shed a couple of layers, which we refer to as thermoregulation. As they're doing so, the lone hiker that left after them stopped and had a very friendly conversation with them. And then continued on his way. Fred and James got their gear together and they continued upward as well. Along the way, they were hiking pretty methodically. James would tell you that he was a slow hiker by nature and was always the last person in any group he went out hiking with. And today was no different from that. And along the way, they're bantering back and forth. They're laughing, they're joking around, as you would imagine that, two friends would be out for this day, where one of them is planning on a pretty good day out in a new accomplishment in his hiking trajectory. Along the way, they take photographs of one another. This is a photo that James took of Fred. You can see here the freshly fallen snow, and then a photograph that Fred took of James. Again, they made pretty slow going as they made their way up. And as they got up to the upper reaches of Little Haystack near Shining Rock Junction, there was a hiker that was unknown to them that was already approaching the upper reaches of the mountain. And as this hiker is breaking tree line, and he has since come forward since the book came out, and I've had an opportunity to speak with him. But at 10:34 in the morning, just before he's breaking tree line on Little Haystack, he takes a photograph, and you can see here, you can see the ridge line where James and Fred are planning to go. You can see this patch of blue sky out here in the distance, again, freshly fallen snow. But you'll also note this dark, thick cloud cover that's starting to move in, including frozen fog that's starting to establish itself in the ravine. So again, as they get up toward the high reaches, they're approaching Shining Rock Junction, where they're planning to stop and have a lunch together. And this is where they start to encounter people descending the mountain. And the first folks that they descend are a pair of hikers that approached tree line at Little Haystack, went a little bit beyond it, decided today is not the day to be out here. The visibility was low, and they turned around and descended. I talked to them and talked to James about this encounter, and neither James nor the pair remember any conversation that took place between them at all. It was basically just hikers going up, hikers going down, passing by one another without stopping for conversation. They continue to make their way up, and then James and Fred encounter the lone hiker who they had at first encountered lower down on the mountain. He stops and again has another friendly conversation with them. He doesn't tell them what he experienced up above. He just went up and summited. He had no intention of doing the traverse that day, and made his way down. He continued downward. And while right around the time this is happening at 11:16 a.m., the lone hiker up above, who this last hiker that saw James and Fred did encounter, took another photograph. And you can see now from the summit of Little Haystack, you can barely see the ridge line. You cannot see the Lincoln or Lafayette out here in the distance. And now the overcast has arrived and this frozen fog has completely settled in. You can see maybe a flurry of snow or two here in the distance. So the weather is starting to arrive and starting to get worse. James and Fred stopped at Shining Rock Junction for lunch, where they had contact with that hiker that took that photograph. And he stopped and had a more direct conversation with them and said, it's completely socked in up above, probably not a good idea, nothing to see beyond that, probably just best to go up summit and go back down. But as you can see, based on these photographs that Fred and James took of each other on the summit of Little Haystack after lunch, that conversation did not deter them or cause them to alter the plan. You'll note again, it's very socked in. It's snowing more regularly now, just, as you can see in these images. And James recalls breaking tree line and how unique of an experience that was for him compared to the other times he's broken tree line in the other 3 seasons. And he recalls turning around and looking behind him and losing sight of tree line because of the poor visibility and losing footsteps. The further up they go, he could not really see his tracks that he was making upward. As they got to the top, he mentions to Fred, hey, how are we going to see when we need to get down on the other side of the traverse? And Fred told him that they would be okay. And again, James took that and didn't ask any further questions, and it was just left where it was. So let's talk now about when we refer to terrain traps in the mountains. These are things like deep snow that you might step into and sink up to your knee. For those of you that don't winter hike and can recall sledding in your backyard and punching through snow, there are various things up in the mountains that can create problems for us. But those aren't the only kinds of traps that we need to think about, whether we're hiking, driving our car, or whatever it is or activity we choose to be engaged in. And those are things that we call heuristics or mental shortcuts. And let's go through a few examples of what that might look like for James and Fred without speculating, but also how those things apply to us, because they certainly do. This is our brain's effort in really moving us through our day in as efficient a manner as possible in regard to all of the decisions that you and I have to make at any given moment. And particularly when the brain finds that there's some familiarity or something similar to what we've done in the past, if it's allowed to do so, it's just going to move us through it without taking in data or additional information that might cause us to rethink that decision that we're making. So the first one is the planning fallacy. And this is what happens when we're putting together a plan, an itinerary, or a project, and we will often look at that through the most optimistic lens possible as we're developing the plan in general. We can underestimate the amount of time it takes that's going to take us to complete it. Again, we're looking at it, putting together and thinking it's going to be done in the shortest time possible. We can underestimate the complexity of that plan, the variables that exist within it, and we can underestimate, therefore, the risks associated. At the same time, we can overestimate our own ability to accomplish it. We can overestimate our level of experience or expertise, or the wisdom that we bring to it. And if we're part of a pair or a group, we can overestimate the experience or expertise of the person or the group of people that we're with. And so this is very important. And I ask you to reflect on a recent plan that you had, and then ask yourself, did that go according to plan? Were there complications, and were you able to accomplish it in the time that you had initially allotted? I'm pretty confident we've each got one, but I just wanted to have you connect with it if you could for the purposes of the discussion. The next one is the familiarity heuristic, and I've mentioned that word earlier. This is when we find ourselves in situations that are very familiar to us. They may be recent, they may be those from the past. This is a photograph of Fred on the summit of Mount Lafayette 7 days before his attempt at the traverse with James, and 1 day after my traverse of the same ridge. This is a photograph that was taken of him during a solo hike that he did by another hiker who he handed his camera to. And Fred did this traverse in the same direction he was planning to do it with James. The weather was actually a bit more favorable that week prior than it was the day that James and Fred are standing there. And he did it in a pretty rapidly. Again, he's got a really high level of physical fitness. This could be an example, and I'm not saying it is, but this might be an example where Fred could potentially be thinking, relating to what happened the week before, since it was so recent and the weather was so similar, than what he's dealing with now. Because right now, where he and James are standing, the winds over on Mount Washington are 13 miles an hour from the southwest, and the temperature is 0. Where they're standing at just under, right about 4,000 feet, the winds might be between 10 and 13 or so, and maybe 0 to, a couple of degrees above 0. The weather is likely pretty similar where they're standing. So again, this is just those situations where we can just bring that into the present. And from a planning and, duration perspective, Fred did the traverse pretty quickly last week. He was moving on his own, and when he hiked alone, he moved, with fluidity and with efficiency. Might he be taking that and transferring that time to the current itinerary that he has with James? And is he factoring in the fact that James is a slow hiker by nature? They had been out together on numerous occasions, but is Fred, taking that additional information into account? The next one is the consistency heuristic. This is when we make that initial decision to move or to do something, and every decision that follows it is done in a way that's consistent with the first one. Again, it's our brain moving with efficiency, kind of moving in a streamlined way, and not taking that, factoring in, weighing in that additional information that it makes itself available to us, and how we might handle that information when it comes in. The next one is expert halo. This is when I'm part of a pair or a group and we're underway. It doesn't really matter what we're doing, whether we're in the mountains or outside of the mountains. And I'm starting to grow uneasy. I have some uncertainty, and I don't speak up because I perceive that there's an expert or a number of experts, people with a higher level of experience than me, someone with authority or title or a power dynamic or a social dynamic that I don't have. And therefore, I'm not going to speak up and share my concerns, even though I might see things going wrong, because I'm afraid that I'm going to be criticized, isolated, marginalized, or removed from that group altogether. And so I basically just go along to get along because I have that discomfort in that setting that I find myself in with this other person or with this group. The last one is the acceptance heuristic. And the best example I can give of that is what took place with me and the two I was with 8 days before James and Fred were up there. I wanted to be accepted into this pair. I wanted them to like me. I wanted them to respect my ability and feel I had the requisite experience and expertise to be up there with them. I felt I had that, but what I was lacking in was fitness and lacking in candor. I just could not bring myself, as what I perceived to be a guest in this group, I couldn't bring myself to express concern about what we're doing because I was afraid they would be disappointed in me about cutting their day short or forcing them to alter their plans. So again, I very much like Expert Halo, I went along to get along, but potentially not only put myself at risk, but the two people that I was with that day. So let's go back to the ridgeline with James and Fred. The wind is currently, it's at their backs as they're moving across the ridgeline at maybe 13 miles an hour or so. Visibility is bad, but there's nothing that James can recall that indicates there's any kind of a problem. This is an image from the National Weather Service showing this cold front that's moving very rapidly from west to east and rapidly approaching the White Mountains as James and Fred are out there fully exposed on this ridge line. You can see this low pressure system I mentioned that moved through on Saturday night into the early morning hours of Sunday that's currently parked off the coast of Maine. And at right about 2 o'clock or so, James and Fred are approaching the base of Mount Lincoln. Everything is going as planned when there is a sudden and violent shift in the direction of the weather and the intensity of the wind. It moves immediately from the south-southwest to directly from the west and just slams into them from the side. They encounter a really intense snow squall that brings much heavier snow than what you saw falling in the photographs of them on the summit of Little Haystack. And this wind speed and wind strength is like nothing that James has ever experienced before. Not only that, but the falling snow that's being blown around by the wind creates kind of that snow globe effect, and visibility, which was already bad, gets even worse. This wind also picks up that fresh layer of snow that fell overnight that had yet to freeze and crystallize and creates really a ground blizzard-like situation. James completely loses all sense of spatial awareness. He doesn't know where he is or what to do or where to go. Fred goes over to him. They're screaming to one another, not out of anger, but it's the locomotive sound of the wind that's just overwhelming them to the point where they have to yell to be heard. And Fred tells him, we're going to execute a bailout. We're going to go back the way we came immediately, follow the ridge line back over to Little Haystack, drop down onto Falling Waters Trail, get down below tree line where we'll be in the safety of the canopy of the trees. And Fred immediately starts to execute that plan. James takes very few steps following him and stops. He's frozen in fear. He can't go any further. He's just, again, consumed with this. Fred sees this, goes back to him, and James tells him there's absolutely no way they're going to get back to Little Haystack. The wind is going to kill them. He believes they need relief right now. They need to find shelter immediately. Fred told him that that's not possible here, and James continued to plead. And I want you to think about the difficulty of this situation, not only for James being in something he hasn't experienced before, but for Fred, who's executing a bailout plan based on his experience, but his very close friend is so overwhelmed that he just wants to try to help him instantly, as soon as he possibly can. And so he tells James, okay, we're going to move back toward Mount Lincoln. And Fred then drops down off the leeward side to try to get out of the wind a little bit to see if he can find some shelter as James follows behind him. This is another radar image that just gives you a sense of the scope of the storm as it's moving across the ridge. The other factor here is not only was this low pressure system out in the Gulf pulling energy from that front, there was another trough of low pressure that actually stalled in Franconia Notch over Franconia Ridge that created that very intense squall dynamic that Fred and James and people skiing on Cannon and Waterville and driving in the area all had to contend with. And these are images from the observatory haze chart, which measures wind speed, and the thermograph, which measures ambient air temperature. And you can see here at 2:15 in the afternoon just how sharp of an increase and immediate the increase in wind speed was, and the strength and sustainability of the gusts, and a 6-degree drop in ambient air temperature, which is very significant drop for the middle of the afternoon. So this is a video that was shared with me after the book came out by two hikers who read the book and who were out on Mount Adams, which is one of the northernmost peaks in the Presidential Range, north of Mount Washington, just south of Mount Madison, which is the northernmost peak in the Presidentials. And they're attempting to do Lowe's Path. And this video footage, which has been spliced together to shorten it, when they break tree line, this is the same time that James and Fred are traversing the ridge. You're going to note that the visibility is a little better over on Mount Adams. And you'll also notice that whereas James and Fred encountered an immediate onset of extreme weather, the weather arrival, and particularly on Mount Adams, is more gradual in nature. And so you'll see a slower deterioration in visibility and a slower increase in wind speed. At the end of the video, these hikers are lost, and they're trying to find Lowe's Path at tree line. They're trying to find the trail entrance. This is taking place at right around the very same time that Fred is trying to find shelter for he and James. You'll note that the weather at the end of this video is very similar to now what James and Fred are contending with over on Franconia Ridge. And the reason I show this is just to give some context and the fact that there were other people out that day, but also to show you how variable the weather can be between the peaks throughout the White Mountains. This lasts about 2 minutes. Fortunately, they were able to find the trail and descend Lowe's Path with lessons learned for certain, just based on my conversation with one of the hikers that was involved in this. So as I mentioned, Fred went in search of shelter, was able to find some. It was not optimal. Basically, they had to get into this void and lie shoulder to shoulder on granite rock, which was very claustrophobic, very confining space, not optimal at all. And their plan initially was to, kind of wait out the squall to see if it might pass by. It did not. And then their strategy became, look, we're going to emerge from here every hour on the hour in hopes that we get a window of opportunity with the weather that we can descend down. That plan went awry as darkness settled in and the storm actually intensified. And then the plan shifted to, one of us is going to stay awake at all times. We'll take shifts throughout the night to monitor one another for hypothermia and frostbite. Their clothing they were wearing was damp already from a day of hiking. The gear that they brought with them became damp with the condensation in this very confined shelter. The water, the fluids they brought with them froze solid. The food they brought with them froze solid. They were unable to eat and drink, which is critical for maintaining core body temperature and avoiding slipping in toward hypothermia, which ultimately does happen over the course of the night. They don't have sleeping bags or a sleeping pad or anything like that to shield themselves and to provide insulation, a barrier between them and the rock that they are lying on. They do know that while they did not leave an itinerary with anybody beyond something informal, just mentioning that they were going up to do some hiking in the Franconia Notch area, no one knew exactly what day that was going to happen, but they felt that coworkers would connect the dots because each lived alone at the time, so they wouldn't actually be overdue that Sunday for anybody in getting home. But that coworkers would connect the dots because Fred had a very early morning bus route he was supposed to do. And when he missed it, they would call Fish and Game, and there would be some semblance of potentially a search starting for them as they were themselves planning to start their self-rescue at 6:30 in the morning. They got up at 6:30 as planned, had a lot of difficulty putting their gear on and left some of it behind, got back up onto the ridge line after a short ascent of the slope, and were immediately bombarded with very strong winds, 60, 70, 80 miles an hour, deadly wind chill temperatures of 40, 50, 60 below. Remember, they're already in some stage of hypothermia from this overnight stay. They're getting knocked over. They're crawling in between gusts. And at one point, Fred takes them off trail behind a rock outcropping just for them to try to kind of recenter. James does not recall how long they stayed there, but he knew they had to keep moving, which they did. And as they approached the junction of Franconia Ridge and Falling Waters and were about 150 feet from getting to the safety of tree line, Fred collapses. And as much as James tried to get him to stand up to go with him to tree line because it was so close, he just wasn't able to do so. And Fred would ultimately go unconscious and he would perish there, sadly. James does what I can best describe as really a walk of resignation and grief. He believes he's going to die there. He is grieving the loss of his friend and makes no effort whatsoever to link back up with the Falling Waters Trail, which is consistent with somebody who's very hypothermic and just kind of hikes along the backside of Little Haystack on the opposite side of where the trailhead was, and he goes unconscious as well. As I mentioned, a search effort was starting to be coordinated early in the morning. Once it was found that Fred and James were potentially in trouble, over the course of the investigatory phase, they were able to find Fred's car. They were able to piece together that in all likelihood, they had done the Franconia Ridge Loop. And so the incident commander from Fish and Game started to call in members of his own advanced search and rescue team from that organization, and then two volunteer rescue organizations, Mountain Rescue Service and Pemi Valley Search and Rescue Team. I just would like to note the Upper Valley Wilderness Response Team, a very, very good team that resides in your part of the state in the Upper Valley, and I very much appreciate their work as well, and just wanted to acknowledge them. But the teams start to respond in, and this just gives you a sense of the weather forecast for the Monday. This was posted at about 4:09 in the morning at the observatory, and you see very cold, very windy, and it's only going to get worse over the course of the day and into the evening as this search effort is underway. So this just gives you a sense of the ground and air search. I'll start with the air search. This is the grid pattern that was flown by the New Hampshire Army National Guard Black Hawk helicopter on the leeward side. They then went to refuel and then came back and flew the same pattern on the windward side, on the Franconia Notch side, before they were called off early evening because the conditions were just not good. They were not really able to search the ridgeline because of the poor visibility and really had to stay kind of down on the lower reaches, and so would not have been able to detect Fred or James on Little Haystack. From a ground search perspective, the incident commander looked at past missions and past hiker behavior in winds with a direction from the north-northwest, and he knew that hikers who got into trouble up on the ridge often got kind of nudged off of the ridge line and drop down into the leeward side because they're able to get out of the wind. And yet they find themselves out in the Pemi wilderness, which is incredibly remote. So he sent a team of 2 from Fish and Game on snow machines. They would break out on foot and work their way towards the backside of Franconia Ridge. A team of 2 from Mountain Rescue Service would ascend Liberty Springs Trail. A combination of Mountain Rescue and Fish and Game would ascend Falling Waters. A combination of Mountain Rescue and Fish and Game would ascend Old Bridle to Greenleaf. And a team from Pemi Search and Rescue would do the Skookum Truck Trail, which is the northernmost trail that brings you up onto the ridge. And then another team of 2 would do, from Fish and Game, would do the Greenleaf Trail. All of these teams would attempt to get up toward tree line. They dealt with very arduous conditions. It snowed yet again overnight, Sunday into Monday. And they often find themselves breaking trail in knee, thigh, waist, and chest deep snow, particularly chest deep for the 2 from Mountain Rescue that did the Liberty Springs route. The idea here is to contain and cut off James and Fred, that if they are bailing out, they're containing them to a certain extent and potentially will cut them off by encountering them on the route. But they're also looking for signs of James and Fred, maybe a discarded piece of gear or a footprint in the snow, maybe a burnt map, any kind of object that might show where they had been, which would help them further focus in on their route. This is just an image taken from inside the cabin of the Black Hawk that day that shows you just how difficult it is to search this kind of terrain from the air. So at about 7 o'clock at night, after breaking out at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, it takes a long time to get search and rescue assets into the mountains in New Hampshire, as the Upper Valley team can tell you, having been on many of these. But at about 7 o'clock at night, teams started to approach tree line, and the team from Mountain Rescue Service radioed down to Incident Command saying they wanted to do a sweeping search up towards Little Haystack to try to summit, whereas Little Haystack isn't all that far from tree line here at Falling Waters Trail. They were given the green light to do so. They spread out as best they could. They only had individual headlamps they were wearing. Again, it's really, really dark. A lot of blowing snow, again, because it's just being picked up by the really strong winds. It's brutally cold with the wind chill. And as they're making their way up towards the ridge and the summit, one rescuer sees a piece of reflective material out in the distance. He approaches it, and there he finds Fred. And sadly, Fred had died. It was obvious to the rescuer that he had not survived. And another rescuer at right around the same time, closer to the summit cone of Little Haystack, detects footprints in the snow leading off toward the backside of Little Haystack, makes a decision to break away from his teammates and follow it for fear that he was going to lose sight of them altogether because the conditions were so bad, follows the tracks for a short distance, and ultimately finds James half buried in drifting snow, and although unconscious, really miraculously showing signs of life. And so the mission takes on a much higher degree of urgency. This is a photograph of James after he had been wrapped in a very thick insulated jacket owned by one of the rescuers and placed inside one of the rescuers' bivy sacks, which is kind of like a tent shell, more or less. And you can see them standing around him in a half circle, trying to keep him from getting any colder. They knew that James would not survive being carried down the mountain. It would take hours to do so. And because he was hypothermic, they ran the risk of putting him into cardiac arrest, and would ultimately prove fatal in a situation like this, where they would have nothing to help him survive or in an attempt to revive him. They made a decision to call the Black Hawk back from Concord to see if it might have a window of opportunity to land. And luckily, as the helicopter arrived and was searching for a location, the clouds parted just enough to provide enough of a clearing that the pilot was able to pick out a location near the rescuers in the summit where he could touch down, and where the crew chief would jump out, find himself in chest deep snow, work his way over to the rescuers, and they would carry James to the Black Hawk for him to be transported to Littleton Regional Hospital. While this was happening, the two members of Mountain Rescue Service that were over on Liberty Springs had reached the ridge, overheard the radio calls of their teammates, and that they had a survivor. And between the two of them, worked very hard over a long distance, taking turns, breaking trail through chest-high snow, but did not arrive here in time, not only for the first Black Hawk taking James, but the Black Hawk returned to take the remaining rescuers and Fred off the mountain, which they did. But the two rescuers that went through this massive effort to get there to help missed the Black Hawk ride and ultimately had to find the trailhead to Falling Waters and work their way down the mountain, and were the last two to come off the mountain at about 1 o'clock on Tuesday morning. So this is just a mapping view of where the Black Hawk landed, how close James and Fred not only were to one another, but also sadly how close they were to the safety of tree line. And then lastly, these are the state and federal organizations that were involved in the rescue mission. And also, I just want to acknowledge the two volunteer organizations that were involved as well, and the two medical institutions, Dartmouth Hitchcock and Littleton Regional, that were involved in saving James's life. Littleton, on arrival, did a very aggressive intervention to rewarm James, and were able to do so and get him stable enough for him to be flown by DART helicopter to Dartmouth Hitchcock, where he would remain there for 3 months under their good care, but ultimately would have his right leg amputated below his knee due to the complications of the severe frostbite he suffered in his long ordeal with the cold. He would lose half of his left foot and his right pinky finger before being released from the hospital. So that concludes the presentation portion, and I will turn it back over to Jared for question and answer, which I'm very much looking forward to.
Thank you, Ty. That was terrific. It took the book and added other elements as well. It was really interesting to see that video from Mount Adams the same day. Makes it all very concrete and very real. We have a question in chat. Somebody is asking what time it gets dark at that time of year. When would darkness have fallen for them? They're wondering if it was around 5:30.
Yeah, thank you for the question. If memory serves me correctly, I think it was around 5:14 or 5:15 in the afternoon, or early evening, depending on or nighttime in the winter, essentially. Right.
Someone else is asking, where and how is James now?
Thank you for the question. James is doing very well. I keep in touch with him. Communicated with him, I think a little over a week ago. He was just returning from a Paralympic event in the southern part of the country. He's a cyclist, and he competed in a Paralympic race. He volunteers in the wintertime for an adaptive ski program at Mount Sunapee. And really, as a give back, that program helped him start skiing again, something he was very passionate about prior to the accident, but got him back out on skis after he got his prosthetic limb. And he's one of the most optimistic, resilient people I've had the pleasure of meeting in my life. And I'm just so glad to know him and to have worked with him on this. So again, thank you for that question.
Ty, I was thinking myself that your interviews with him must have been very intense and very emotional. And I found myself wondering if it was hard for him to talk about this. Was he reluctant? Was there kind of a confessional aspect? Did he want to talk about it?
Well, I didn't know him, and I reached out to him and asked if I could, told him who I was, asked if I could meet with him to talk about what I was doing and why I was telling the story. And he was very willing to meet with me. And, we met on several occasions. He was very transparent. He's very grounded. He understands what happened and some of the reasons why, and saw value in just being very open about his story and that experience in hopes of helping others who will go out into the backcountry or whatever passion or pursuit they choose to go after. But yeah, it was, and I guess what I'd like people to know is, when I sat down with him, our first conversation was not about the accident. I don't think it was after several lengthy conversations with him about who he was and his background and his history, and before we even got there. But there, certainly when you're talking with somebody about something so personal and so traumatic, it's he handled it with such poise. It was pretty amazing, and I didn't want to make it about my emotions or anything like that. It's his story, and I was just really honored to be able to share it.
Yeah. We have a couple of really interesting questions. Someone is asking why the Black Hawk went to Littleton Regional Hospital and not directly to Dartmouth Hitchcock. Yeah,
thank you for the question. At the time, Littleton was very well known for some pioneering work that was done by a surgeon there over the course of decades in hypothermia and frostbite. It had a national reputation at the time. They had developed protocols for hypothermia and frostbite that were often, they got referrals from across the country, and fortunately the emergency department physician and nursing staff who were on the night James was brought there had been trained in those protocols and obviously executed them incredibly. I mean, he was at that time, James, and still the record still stands, he's the coldest core temperature in the Northeast who was fully revived. And a lot of that rewarming effort took place at Littleton and continued at Dartmouth Hitchcock. So yeah, it's a great New Hampshire piece of that side of that story.
Pertaining to that, we have a really interesting note from William Young. I'll read it out. He writes, Dr. Harry McDade at Littleton Hospital thawed me out in 1972. 4 young hikers, including me, made many heuristic mistakes. Our presidential traverse followed Kate's route up onto Edmund's Call for 2 nights and a crawl down through a storm. I love Treeline. Your storytelling and analysis are helpful. Thank you.
Just thank you very much for sharing that, William. And thank you for mentioning Dr. McDade and your experience with him. That's really moving. Thank you.
It was. Your stories are very moving. Thank you.
Thanks. I'd love to talk with you sometime if you could give your contact information to Jared. I'd just love to just chat and meet you. So thanks.
I'll find you somewhere. We purchased maybe 10 copies of Where You Will Find Me. Everybody on the trip and all our friends just eat it up. It still lives in my mind.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Ty, Lauren is asking the question that I keep coming back to myself, so I'm glad she asked it. She saved me the trouble. And I'm sure you've been asked this many times, but it concerns the decision to bail out versus making the way back to Little Haystack. She says, do you think things might have ended differently had they proceeded with the original bailout plan of turning around on Sunday afternoon? And particularly as someone who did do a lot of winter hiking this winter and encountered some pretty intense situations, I've asked myself that over and over again from a practical standpoint. Is there any way of assessing whether things might have gone differently if they had proceeded with the original plan?
Thank you, Lauren, for the question. I got that question last night. I get that question regularly, and it's one of the more challenging questions to answer because it's so hard to know. I don't want to speculate. Fred was executing a plan that he believed would work. We don't know if they had continued on, if they might have encountered another variable or series of variables or problems in that half-mile hike back. So I don't think we can know for sure. But I think, this is a situation, and I keep going back to their friendship and the impact and the weight that had on Fred's decision to seek shelter immediately rather than continue working their way across the ridge. So it's very hard to know unless we find ourselves in a situation similar to that. I do think taking ourselves out of that situation, if we were to find ourselves in it, I think a lot of this comes down to experience level, familiarity with where you are, where Treeline is, and the gear that you have with you at the time. I think those are all factors that go into it for certain. If they had bailed off of the ridge line rather than gone back to tree line, that also would bring with it a host of additional risks because of the steepness of the terrain, how deep the snow is, and how bad the weather was.
Thank you. We have several more questions. Someone is asking, Jennifer is asking, can you connect your 5 heuristic bullets with their decision-making process?
I think I don't want to speculate, but based on what I know, based on my conversations with James, I think if we look at the planning fallacy, I think you could say there was potentially an underestimation of the amount of time it was actually going to take them to do the traverse with that weather forecasted to arrive in the afternoon. Familiarity, I go back to the fact that Fred had been on that ridge numerous times and as short as 1 week prior in very similar weather. The expert halo piece, I think at some level comes in, not because there was a power dynamic between the two. They were good friends. There was equity there. But James would readily tell you, as he told me, that he defaulted all decision-making on planning and itinerary and decision-making to whoever he would go out hiking with. He left that to other people. That's just who he was at that time. So you can see that dynamic where even if James had seen things starting to get difficult or had concerns, he may have just remained silent on that because, he really placed a lot of trust in the people that he went with and defaulted that decision-making and the logistical side to them. In terms of the acceptance, it's hard to connect it to this story because they were already friends and they had already gone hiking on numerous occasions. And I have to believe that they would have continued to hike together regardless of whether James wanted to winter hike or not. So I don't think there was anything to that side of it. And I'm not sure if there was another one, and I might just not be recalling that bullet of the 5. But I hope that helps.
Thank you. There are 2 more questions. Bree is asking, how has your approach to hiking in the White Mountains changed after researching and writing these 2 books?
Well, I think my approach to hiking in the White Mountains changed as a result of my own experience. The 8 days before, I always felt I prepared well, and I continued to do so. I think where I fell short was just in my inability to be candid in a respectful way and transparent about what I was experiencing at the time. I do think in doing the research on these stories, the first thing I just want to say is, I can't say enough about the search and rescue community in New Hampshire, Fish and Game, Forest Service, but at the Army National Guard, but the volunteer teams, so much expertise, so much humility that I'm just reminded of each time I tell these. But I did do a really deep dive into decision making and decision bias and heuristics, and I do put more thought into decisions, whether I'm above tree line or at work or going about my day in other ways, driving my car. So I would say that's where the influence has been.
One of the things I wasn't expecting about the book, but really enjoyed, was how much time you gave to the search and rescue operations and how detailed that account was. And that itself is really gripping, and I learned a lot just from that.
Oh, thanks.
The last question we have from Megan is, assuming they had cell phones that hadn't run out of battery, would that have helped search and rescue narrow down their location better? She's just wondering if having GPS info is helpful, or whether it's not, if weather conditions are so bad and it's not safe for search and rescue to get up there.
Well, I think it's helpful if it's accurate. And there's a couple of things I'll say about that. James and Fred elected to leave their cell phones in their car. And I know that can seem hard to believe, but that was in 2008, when our phones were not an extension of our bodies at this point, right? So you were very comfortable leaving them in the car and not always being reachable at that time. Had they had them, and if Fish and Game was able to work with the cell carriers to ping the phone, if that was possible at the time, if the technology had existed, remember, probably fewer cell towers back then, but the accuracy of that coordinate is important. And if for those of you that read Where You'll Find Me are familiar with the story of Kate Matrasova, the rescuers had a tough time determining exactly where Kate was because the GPS coordinates from her emergency beacon were all over the place due to the terrain and the position of the antenna on that beacon. So I think one of the things I always like to emphasize when I get this question is if we solely rely on things that are powered by batteries and rely on satellite technology, I think that's probably not the best strategy. I think having map and compass skills and knowing really how to use your GPS and knowing where you are in relation to your itinerary and where you are in the map, I think is very important. And it's just critically important to leave an itinerary, and I would recommend with 2 people that live in different homes. So leave one with somebody that you're very close with, and then have a contingency itinerary that you leave with somebody else in the event that the person you leave it with forgets or loses it or whatever might happen. You have that second person that's going to be keeping an eye out for you and waiting to hear from you as well. So I hope that answered the question.
That's great. Well, thank you all so much for being here with us tonight. And Ty, thank you so much for doing this program for us. That was a real pleasure.
Thank you, Jared. Thank you, Megan. And thank you, everybody. And please be well. I wish you all the best. And I hope our paths cross when we don't have to be virtual anymore.
Good night, everyone.
Take care.
Thank you.
Good night.